This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The camping trip to the heart of the Floridian wilderness was supposed to be a chance for the Carter family to reconnect. For years, they had operated like ships passing in the night, bound together by name but divided by the pressures of everyday life. Martin, the patriarch, was a stern and practical man, a contractor who spent long hours managing projects and often came home too tired to engage with his children beyond the occasional question about their grades. Lisa, his wife, tried to bridge the gap, but her role as the family mediator left her emotionally drained, particularly when it came to Ellie, their eldest daughter. Ellie was 14, poised on the cusp of adulthood but burdened by a storm of emotions she didn't fully understand. Her relationship with her parents had grown increasingly fraught, marked by sharp reprimands and icy silences. She was painfully aware of how often her mother compared her to her siblings, Jack and Mia, who seemed to embody the picture-perfect children Lisa had always wanted. Jack was 10, bright-eyed and adventurous, the type of boy who eagerly volunteered for school plays and scouts. Mia, the youngest at 6, was the darling of the family, perpetually cheerful and overflowing with the innocent charm that drew smiles wherever she went. Ellie, with her brooding disposition and simmering resentment, felt like the black sheep. When Martin proposed the camping trip, the idea was met with tepid enthusiasm. The promise of fresh air and bonding time sounded good in theory, but the Carters' fractured dynamics made the prospect feel more like an obligation than an adventure. Still, Lisa packed the family's gear with determination, stuffing sleeping bags, a portable stove, and enough snacks to placate even the most reluctant camper. Ellie barely participated in the preparations, retreating to her room to scroll through her phone while her mother's voice echoed through the house. When they finally loaded the SUV, Ellie slipped into the back seat with her headphones on, pretending to be absorbed in her music as Mia and Jack chattered excitedly about seeing wildlife. The drive to the forest was long and uneventful, stretching into an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional GPS instruction or Martin's terse comments about the traffic. As they left the highway and turned onto the winding dirt roads that led to the campsite, Ellie stared out the window at the dense canopy of trees, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in. The wilderness had always unsettled her, a tangle of shadows and secrets that seemed endless. Her unease was amplified when they reached the campsite, a secluded spot surrounded by towering oaks and cypress trees. There were no other campers in sight, only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant trill of birds. Martin and Jack worked together to set up the tents while Lisa organized their supplies, her tone sharp as she directed Ellie to help with the firewood. Ellie's protests were met with a scowl, and she reluctantly trudged off into the underbrush, collecting twigs and logs while muttering under her breath. As the fire crackled to life, the family gathered around it for their first meal in the wilderness, a simple affair of hot dogs and marshmallows. Jack and Mia giggled as they roasted their skewers, but Ellie sat apart, her arms crossed, staring into the flames as if willing them to consume her frustration. The first night passed without incident, though Ellie struggled to sleep, her mind churning with a restless energy she couldn't shake. The forest seemed alive with whispers, the faint rustle of animals blending with the creak of branches to form an unsettling symphony. By morning, the tension in the air had grown palpable. Martin was already snapping at Lisa about the map, and Ellie could feel her mother's exasperation radiating like heat. Jack and Mia, oblivious to the undercurrents, scampered around the campsite, playing an elaborate game of tag that sent them crashing through the underbrush. As the day wore on, Ellie's resentment simmered just beneath the surface. Her mother's nagging grated on her nerves, and her father's clipped commands made her feel small and insignificant. She retreated further into herself, spending hours wandering the forest alone under the pretense of exploring. The solitude offered some relief, but it also amplified the dark thoughts she had tried to suppress. She found herself drawn to the hunting knife her father had packed, its sleek blade a stark contrast to the chaotic wilderness around her. The knife became a fixation, a symbol of power and control in a world where she felt utterly powerless. By the second evening, the cracks in the family's fragile harmony had widened into chasms. An argument erupted between Ellie and Lisa over something trivial, a misplaced flashlight, and escalated quickly. Lisa's voice rose, sharp with frustration, while Ellie's retorts grew increasingly venomous. Martin tried to intervene, but his booming voice only added to the chaos. Jack and Mia watched from the sidelines, their earlier exuberance replaced by uneasy silence. When Ellie finally stormed off into the woods, no one followed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a shroud of darkness. Ellie sat on a fallen log, clutching the knife she had taken from her father's supplies. The weight of it in her hand felt both comforting and terrifying, a tangible reminder of the storm brewing within her. The sounds of the campsite faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. In the stillness, Ellie's mind raced, replaying years of slights and grievances, each memory feeding the fire of her anger. As the night deepened, the family settled into an uneasy truce. Martin stoked the fire while Lisa tucked Jack and Mia into their sleeping bags, her face lined with exhaustion. Ellie's absence went unremarked, the tension too raw for anyone to make the first move. When she finally returned to the campsite, her face unreadable, the family pretended not to notice. They retreated to their respective tents, the unspoken hope that a night's sleep would ease the strain. But for Ellie, sleep did not come. The knife lay beside her, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the tent. Her thoughts spiraled into a dark abyss, the boundaries between reality and fantasy blurring as the forest seemed to close in around her. Ellie Carter had always been different. From a young age, she found it difficult to connect with others, her thoughts moving in directions that seemed to alienate her from her peers and even her family. While her younger siblings flourished in their roles within the household, Ellie withdrew, her inner world becoming an intricate labyrinth of frustrations, fears, and dark fantasies. What no one around her understood or perhaps cared to notice was the depth of her struggle. Ellie wasn't simply a moody teenager, she was a storm, slowly brewing, her mind filled with shadows she couldn't control. In school, Ellie was neither popular nor entirely ostracized. She existed in the nebulous space between, where she was just present enough to avoid being invisible but far too awkward and quiet to feel truly seen. Her classmates had a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl, an unnerving mix of indifference and judgment. The whispers were subtle but cutting, spreading through hallways and classrooms with a precision that only adolescents could master. Weird, creepy off-the-words hung in the air, clinging to her like a second skin. Her home life offered little solace. To her parents, Ellie was a problem they didn't know how to solve. Martin's solution was to ignore her unless she did something that disrupted his tightly managed world, in which case he reacted with frustration or outright anger. Lisa's attempts to connect were half-hearted at best, often devolving into lectures about Ellie's attitude or lack of effort in school. Her siblings adored their parents and basked in their attention, leaving Ellie to feel like an outsider in her own family. She often wondered if her parents would even notice if she vanished one day, swallowed whole by the yawning void she felt growing inside her. Ellie's room became her sanctuary, the one place where she could control her environment. The walls were covered in drawings that hinted at the complexity of her mind's stark, abstract sketches of faceless figures, twisted trees, and fractured landscapes. The artwork disturbed Lisa, who suggested Ellie draw happier things, but Ellie ignored her. Her sketchbook was filled with images. She couldn't show anyone scenes of violence and chaos that she didn't fully understand, but felt compelled to create. The act of drawing was a release, a way to quiet the screaming thoughts in her head, even if only temporarily. More troubling than her art, however, were Ellie's increasingly vivid fantasies. At first they were harmless imaginings, fleeting thoughts of standing up to bullies or confronting her parents in a dramatic outburst. But over time they grew darker, more detailed, and disturbingly specific. She would lie awake at night, her mind spinning elaborate scenarios in which she held all the power, scenarios where she wasn't the weak, overlooked girl anymore. These thoughts scared her, but they also thrilled her, offering a twisted sense of control she couldn't find in the real world. Her fascination with violence deepened as she discovered online communities that catered to her darker interests. She devoured stories of notorious crimes, true and fictional, becoming fixated on the psychology of those who committed them. Why did they do it? What pushed them to the edge? Ellie scoured articles and forums, her search history a trail of macabre curiosity that would have horrified her parents if they'd ever bothered to check. She didn't see herself as a potential danger, not yet. To her, it was just an escape, a way to channel the emotions she couldn't otherwise express. Physically, Ellie began to change as well. Her eating habits became erratic, and she spent hours locked in her room, pacing or sitting perfectly still, staring into space. Sleep eluded her most nights, her mind racing with intrusive thoughts that refused to let her rest. On the rare occasions she did sleep, her dreams were vivid and disturbing, filled with imagery that lingered long after she woke. She would wake up breathless, her heart pounding, the line between dream and reality blurring. Her parents noticed the changes but chalked them up to typical teenage angst. Martin dismissed her mood swings as drama, while Lisa fretted over Ellie's slipping grades but did little to address the underlying issues. They never asked why she spent so much time alone or why her once bright eyes had grown dull and distant. The more they ignored her, the deeper Ellie sank into herself, her resentment festering like a wound. What no one saw, what Ellie herself struggled to understand, was the depth of her anger. It wasn't the kind of anger that flared up and faded quickly. It was a slow, simmering rage that consumed her from the inside out. She felt it in every interaction with her family, every glance they exchanged that didn't include her, every laugh she wasn't a part of. She felt it in the way her mother doted on Mia, in the way her father called Jack his little man, in the way they both seemed to view Ellie as a burden rather than a blessing. Her anger became a constant companion, whispering in her ear, feeding her darkest thoughts. By the time the family embarked on their camping trip, Ellie's mental state had reached a tipping point. The isolation of the forest, the suffocating closeness of her family, and the ever-present reminder of her insignificance all worked together to push her further toward the edge. She had packed the knife on impulse, telling herself it was for survival, but deep down she knew the truth. The knife represented something far more sinister, a choice, a way to seize control in a life that felt utterly out of her hands. Ellie's hidden struggles were a perfect storm, a convergence of neglect, alienation, and unchecked mental illness that no one had cared enough to notice. As the days in the forest stretched on, the darkness inside her grew, fed by years of pain and anger. It was no longer a question of if Ellie would snap, but when and how devastating the fallout would be. The Carter family's second day in the Florida wilderness began with an oppressive quiet. The forest, which had seemed alive with possibility the day before, now loomed dark and menacing. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting long, distorted shadows over the campsite. Ellie woke early, her sleep fractured by unsettling dreams she couldn't quite remember. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the muffled sounds of her parents moving outside the tent. The air felt heavy, as though the forest itself was bracing for something unspeakable. Breakfast was a strained affair. Martin had burned the bacon over the campfire, eliciting a sharp remark from Lisa, who was already irritated by the children's restless energy. Mia spilled orange juice on the picnic table, and Jack kept interrupting his parents' conversation with questions about the day's plans. Ellie sat silently at the edge of the table, picking at her food and watching the scene unfold. Every movement, every sound grated on her nerves. Her parents' voices were too loud, the clatter of utensils too sharp, and Mia's laughter pierced her skull like a needle. She clenched her fists under the table, her nails biting into her palms. After breakfast, the family set out on a hike, following a narrow trail that wound through the forest. Martin led the way, map in hand, while Lisa stayed close to Mia and Jack, pointing out interesting plants and birds. Ellie trailed behind, deliberately falling back until she was out of earshot. The forest felt different today, colder, darker, as though the trees were closing in. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the ground beneath her boots was soft and uneven. She noticed the way the shadows seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, the way the silence was broken by sudden, untraceable noises. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance, and Ellie stopped walking, her heart racing. She didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but something about the forest felt alive, as if it were watching her. By the time they returned to the campsite, tensions had begun to surface. Martin was irritated that the hike had taken longer than expected, and Lisa was visibly tired from trying to keep the younger children entertained. Ellie's silence hadn't gone unnoticed, but her parents were too preoccupied with Jack and Mia to address it. She disappeared into the woods again, this time under the pretense of collecting firewood. In truth, she just wanted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the campsite. Ellie wandered aimlessly, the knife tucked securely into the waistband of her jeans. She hadn't used it yet, but she liked the weight of it, the way it pressed against her skin like a promise. Her thoughts were a swirling mess of anger and despair, punctuated by flashes of violent imagery she couldn't shake. She imagined her parents arguing, their voices rising until they drowned out everything else. She imagined Mia crying, Jack staring in stunned silence. She imagined herself standing in the middle of it all, the knife in her hand, her voice finally loud enough to be heard. When she returned to the campsite, the fire was roaring and dinner was being prepared. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, mingling with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jack and Mia were playing a game near the edge of the clearing, their laughter cutting through the stillness. Ellie's presence went largely unnoticed as she slipped back into the circle of light cast by the fire. She sat on a log, staring into the flames, her mind churning. Her parents' conversation was a dull hum in the background, their words meaningless and distant. That evening, the family gathered around the fire for what was supposed to be a bonding activity. Martin told a story about his own childhood camping trips, his voice steady and confident. Lisa chimed in occasionally, her tone warm but tired. Jack and Mia listened with wide eyes, hanging on their father's every word. Ellie stared at the fire, barely registering the story. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the thoughts she couldn't escape. The knife was in her hand now, hidden under the folds of her sweatshirt. She traced her finger along the blade, feeling its cold, sharp edge. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The younger children were sent to bed first, their protests drowned out by Lisa's insistence that they needed rest for the next day's activities. Martin stayed up to stoke the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Ellie sat nearby, her eyes fixed on the flames. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crackle of burning wood. When Lisa finally joined them, her face drawn with exhaustion, Ellie stood abruptly and announced that she was going for a walk. The forest was pitch black, the light of the fire fading quickly as Ellie moved deeper into the trees. She didn't take a flashlight, relying instead on the faint glow of the moon filtering through the canopy. The darkness felt like a physical presence, wrapping around her and pulling her in. She walked until the sounds of the campsite were completely gone, until the only thing she could hear was the sound of her own breathing. She stopped at a small clearing, the knife in her hand, her thoughts racing. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her parents' disappointment, her siblings' obliviousness, her own sense of failure. It was too much, all of it. And for the first time, she felt like she couldn't hold it in anymore. When Ellie returned to the campsite, her face was unreadable, her movements slow and deliberate. Her parents were still by the fire, talking in low voices. They glanced at her as she approached but said nothing. Ellie slipped into her tent, lying awake for hours, her thoughts spiraling. The knife was beside her, gleaming faintly in the dim light. The forest outside was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the occasional cry of a distant animal. Ellie listened, her heart pounding, as the storm inside her reached a fever pitch. By the time the fire had burned down to embers and her parents had gone to bed, Ellie was wide awake, her body tense with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The night stretched on, the silence inside the tent broken only by the rhythmic breathing of her sleeping family. Ellie stared at the roof of the tent, her mind teetering on the edge of a decision she could never take back. The forest was unnaturally quiet when Ellie made her decision. The air inside the tent was suffocating, thick with the smell of damp fabric and the faint residue of campfire smoke. Her family's breathing filled the space, an uneven rhythm that should have been soothing but instead set her teeth on edge. Ellie lay still for what felt like hours, her eyes wide open, her body vibrating with a nervous energy she couldn't contain. The knife was beside her, its blade catching faint streaks of moonlight filtering through the small mesh window of the tent. Her hand hovered over it, fingers twitching as she wrestled with the storm of thoughts in her head. It started with a single fleeting thought, a spark that quickly ignited into an all-consuming blaze. She couldn't stop now. Everything inside her demanded release, a way to silence the cacophony of resentment, anger, and despair that had been building for years. The knife felt heavy in her hand when she finally gripped it, the weight grounding her in a way nothing else had. She sat up slowly, her movements deliberate, every muscle in her body tense and coiled like a spring. Her breathing was shallow, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears as she unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold, still night. The campsite was cloaked in darkness, the dying embers of the fire casting weak, flickering shadows across the clearing. Ellie moved silently, her bare feet brushing against the soft forest floor. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches tangled against the starless sky. She paused outside her parents' tent, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the knife. A moment of hesitation gripped her, a final whisper of doubt, but it was drowned out by the roar of her own thoughts. This was her moment. This was the only way. Martin was the first. She slipped into the tent, her movements careful and practiced, as if she had rehearsed this in her mind 100 times. He lay on his back, his face slack with sleep, the faint sound of a snore escaping his lips. Ellie stood over him, her body trembling, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife with both hands. She hesitated only for a second before bringing the blade down, the motion quick and forceful. The sound was muted, a sickening thud that seemed to reverberate through her entire body. Martin's eyes flew open, a mixture of shock and pain flashing across his face, but it was too late. Ellie struck again and again, her vision blurring with tears and adrenaline as she worked to silence him. Lisa stirred beside him, the motion jarring Ellie into action. She turned, her heart pounding, as her mother's groggy confusion gave way to horror. Lisa tried to scream, but Ellie moved swiftly, pressing the blade to her throat with a precision that surprised even herself. The struggle was brief, punctuated by shallow gasps and the sound of fabric tearing beneath their movements. Ellie's hands were slick with blood when it was over, her breathing ragged as she stared down at what she had done. Her parents' bodies lay tangled in the confines of the tent, their lifeless eyes reflecting the faint glow of the fire outside. For a moment, Ellie felt an eerie calm wash over her, a stillness she hadn't experienced in years. But it wasn't over. The noise had roused Jack, his voice calling out from the other tent, high-pitched and afraid. Ellie froze, her mind racing. She hadn't planned for this part, hadn't thought about what would happen if someone woke up. Panic surged through her, but it was quickly replaced by a cold determination. She couldn't stop now. She had come too far. Jack was standing when she entered the second tent, his face pale and his eyes wide with confusion. He looked so small in that moment, clutching his sleeping bag like it could protect him. Ellie's hands trembled as she moved toward him, the knife dripping with blood. He backed away, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. But the tent was too small to offer any real escape. Ellie lunged forward, her breath hitching as the blade met resistance. Jack screamed, the sound sharp and piercing, but it was cut short as Ellie pressed her weight down, silencing him. Mia was crying now, her tiny body shaking as she huddled in the corner of the tent. She looked up at Ellie with wide, tear-filled eyes, her face a mask of terror. Ellie hesitated, her resolve wavering for the first time. Mia was so young, so innocent. For a brief moment, Ellie considered stopping, leaving Mia to live, to tell the world what had happened. But the thought of her sister growing up with the memory of this night of Ellie's face was unbearable. She couldn't let it happen. The knife felt heavier than ever as Ellie approached Mia, her steps slow and deliberate. The little girl's sobs filled the air, a sound that would haunt Ellie long after the night was over. She knelt in front of Mia, her vision blurring as tears streamed down her face. Her hands shook as she raised the knife, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to undo what she had done. But it was too late. There was no turning back. When it was over, Ellie stumbled out of the tent, her body numb and her mind blank. The campsite was silent again, the forest swallowing the sounds of her family's final moments. She dropped the knife, her blood-soaked hands hanging limply at her sides as she stared at the ground. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a physical force, threatening to crush her. She felt detached, as though she were watching herself from a distance, her body moving on autopilot. Ellie wandered into the woods, the trees closing in around her as she walked. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do next. The knife was still at the campsite, a silent witness to the horror she had unleashed. Her mind was a chaotic jumble of thoughts, guilt and relief battling for dominance. She didn't feel triumphant or free. She felt empty, hollow, as though she had carved out a part of herself and left it behind with the bodies in the tents. The forest seemed alive with whispers as Ellie disappeared into its depths, the shadows swallowing her whole. The campsite stood still in the moonlight, a macabre tableau of violence and silence. The air was heavy, the forest holding its breath, as if waiting for the first light of dawn to expose the truth of what had happened. The forest was eerily calm in the aftermath of Ellie's actions. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting pale streaks of sunlight over the campsite, illuminating the blood-soaked tents and the remnants of a family that no longer existed. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only a circle of cold ash, its embers extinguished like the lives that had been taken in the night. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded just hours before. Ellie was nowhere near the campsite by the time the morning light touched it. She had wandered deep into the forest, her bare feet caked with mud and her clothes stiff with drying blood. Her mind was a foggy haze, as though she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. She didn't know how long she had been walking or where she was headed. The towering trees all looked the same, their branches reaching overhead like a tangled web. She barely noticed the cold bite of the morning air, or the scratches on her arms from the dense underbrush. Her body moved mechanically, one step after another, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. When she came to a small creek, Ellie stopped. The clear water reflected her image back at her, distorted by the ripples. She crouched down, staring at her reflection, her face smeared with blood and dirt, her eyes hollow and unrecognizable. She dipped her hands into the water, scrubbing at the blood with an almost frantic intensity, but it clung stubbornly to her skin, a reminder that no amount of washing could erase what she had done. Her fingers trembled as she splashed the water on her face, the cold shocking her back into the present moment. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, heavy and inescapable. Back at the campsite, the stillness didn't last long. A pair of hikers following a trail that passed near the clearing were the first to stumble upon the scene. The smell hit them before they saw the carnage, a metallic tang that clung to the air. When they pushed through the brush and into the clearing, their gasps of horror echoed through the trees. The tents were stained with dark, congealed blood, their fabric torn and shredded. The bodies inside were twisted and lifeless, a gruesome tableau that defied comprehension. The hikers didn't linger. One of them scrambled for his phone, dialing emergency services with shaking hands while the other stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. The authorities arrived an hour later, the sound of their vehicles shattering the forest's fragile calm. Police officers, crime scene investigators, and paramedics flooded the campsite, their faces grim as they took in the scene. The bodies were carefully removed, their identities confirmed against the family's camping permit. The sheriff, a grizzled man with decades of experience, stood at the edge of the clearing, his hands on his hips and his face etched with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He had seen his share of tragedies, but this was something else entirely. The brutality of the crime left even the most seasoned officers shaken. Word of the murders spread quickly, first among the local community and then to the national media. News vans lined the narrow dirt road leading to the forest, reporters clamoring for details as they pieced together the story of the Carter family's final moments. Headlines screamed of a family camping trip gone horribly wrong, their sensationalism feeding the public's hunger for every gruesome detail. Pundits speculated wildly, weaving narratives of random attacks, escaped convicts, and even animal maulings. No one, not even the investigators, suspected the truth not yet. Ellie was found 2 days later, miles from the campsite. She was sitting by the same creek she had stumbled upon that first morning, her body curled into herself as though trying to disappear. She didn't resist when the search party approached her, their voices cautious and gentle, as if she were a wounded animal. Her clothes were filthy, her face pale and gaunt. The knife, now rusted and dull, was missing. She had left it behind at the campsite, buried somewhere in the chaos of that night. When they asked her what had happened, she didn't answer. She just stared at them with those empty eyes, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Ellie was taken to the hospital, where doctors examined her for injuries and signs of trauma. Physically, she was unharmed, aside from a few scratches and bruises, but her mental state was another story. She refused to speak, even when questioned by police. She refused to eat, to sleep, to respond to anything around her. It was as though she had shut down entirely, retreating to a place inside herself that no one else could reach. The medical staff called it shock, a protective mechanism in the wake of extreme trauma. But the detectives weren't so sure. There was something about her silence, something calculating, that didn't sit right. As the investigation continued, the truth began to emerge. The forensic evidence painted a chilling picture of the events that had taken place at the campsite. The wounds on the bodies were consistent with a single weapon, and the lack of defensive injuries on the adults suggested they had been attacked in their sleep. The search of Ellie's belongings revealed a sketchbook filled with disturbing images, drawings of knives, blood, and shadowy figures that seemed to hint at the darkness lurking within her mind. Her fingerprints were found on the knife's handle, along with traces of her parents' and siblings' blood. The revelation shocked everyone who had followed the case. The image of Ellie as a grieving survivor was shattered, replaced by the horrifying possibility that she was the perpetrator. The media frenzy intensified, their coverage shifting to dissect every detail of Ellie's life in search of answers. Neighbors described her as quiet and withdrawn, while classmates recalled her as strange and troubled. Psychologists speculated about her mental state, debating whether she had been pushed to the edge by years of neglect and bullying, or if there was something inherently evil about her. Ellie was eventually transferred to a juvenile psychiatric facility, where she remained under constant observation. Her silence persisted, broken only by occasional outbursts of sobbing or laughter that seemed disconnected from reality. The doctors who evaluated her found no clear answers, only more questions. Was she remorseful? Did she even understand what she had done? And if she did, could she ever be rehabilitated? The forest itself remained untouched, a grim monument to the Carter family's final moments. The campsite was cordoned off, but the whispers of what had happened there lingered in the community, spreading like wildfire. Some saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of human connections. Others saw it as an unsolvable puzzle, a mystery that would haunt them for years to come. For Ellie, the aftermath was a void, a hollow existence where time seemed to stretch endlessly. She didn't dream anymore, her sleep a merciful blankness that offered a temporary escape. But when she was awake, the memories of that night were inescapable, replaying in her mind like a broken record. She was trapped in the aftermath of her own actions, a prisoner of a choice she could never undo. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she began to wonder if this was her punishment, not the judgment of the courts or the whispers of the world, but the endless, suffocating silence of her own conscience. The investigation into the Carter family murders began with an air of confusion and dread. For the officers who first arrived on the scene, the crime seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The brutality suggested rage, yet the calculated precision of the attacks hinted at forethought. The campsite told a fragmented story: tents slashed open from the outside, personal belongings scattered in panic, and a bloodstained knife buried beneath a pile of leaves near the fire pit. Nothing about it made sense. Who would target a family on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere? And why? Detectives combed the area for clues, their movements methodical and deliberate. Footprints surrounded the campsite, some large and heavy, likely Martin's, and others smaller, belonging to Lisa and the children. But there was one set that puzzled them: faint, bare footprints leading away from the tents into the forest. These tracks were erratic, weaving in and out of the denser brush, before disappearing entirely near a shallow creek. The search teams followed the trail but found no other signs of the perpetrator, only Ellie, sitting dazed and bloodstained miles from the campsite. At first, the officers treated Ellie as a survivor, perhaps the lone victim spared by a cold-blooded killer. Her initial silence was attributed to trauma, a natural response to the horrific events she had witnessed. She was transported to a hospital, where doctors and therapists worked to stabilize her condition. Law enforcement, meanwhile, began piecing together the events of that night, hoping Ellie's eventual testimony would provide the missing link. But as the evidence was gathered and examined, a chilling possibility began to emerge, one that no one was prepared to confront. The forensics team meticulously analyzed every detail from the scene. The knife found near the fire pit was sent to the lab, its blade yielding a disturbing revelation: it carried only Ellie's fingerprints. The blood spatter patterns inside the tents told an equally grim story, pointing to a single assailant who had moved between the tents with deliberate intent. The cuts on the tents themselves were clean and precise, indicating a steady hand and a controlled state of mind. There were no signs of an external intruder, no broken branches, no other sets of footprints apart from those of the family. Back at the station, detectives began reviewing the Carters' history. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of an ordinary family with typical struggles. Martin was described as strict but caring, while Lisa was remembered as attentive, though occasionally overwhelmed. Jack and Mia were universally adored by their teachers and classmates. Ellie, however, was a different story. Teachers noted her declining grades and withdrawn demeanor, while classmates recalled her as an outsider, prone to angry outbursts and periods of eerie silence. Several mentioned her strange drawings, violent, unsettling images that made her a target for cruel teasing. The detectives delved deeper into Ellie's life, uncovering journal entries and online activity that hinted at her state of mind. Her journals, found in her tent, were filled with rambling, fragmented thoughts, many of them angry and accusatory. There were pages dedicated to her resentment of her siblings, whom she felt had stolen her parents' affection. Other entries were darker, describing violent fantasies that mirrored the events at the campsite with chilling accuracy. Online, Ellie had frequented forums that glorified true crime and explored themes of isolation and revenge. The digital footprint left no doubt she had been teetering on the edge for months, if not years. Ellie's silence was her greatest weapon and her most damning trait. Questioned by detectives, she refused to answer, her hollow gaze unnerving even the most seasoned interrogators. A child psychologist brought in to assess her described her demeanor as a mix of deep-seated anger and emotional detachment. She neither cried nor expressed fear, remaining eerily calm, even when confronted with evidence. Her lack of reaction to the deaths of her family members was perhaps the most telling detail of all. It wasn't apathy, the psychologist concluded, but a deliberate refusal to engage a defense mechanism, or perhaps something far darker. The media latched onto the story with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. The narrative shifted from a tragic family murder to a sensationalized account of Ellie as the prime suspect. Headlines called her the killer child and the forest butcher, painting her as both a victim of neglect and a monster born from rage. Talk shows dissected every scrap of information, inviting experts to debate whether Ellie's actions were a cry for help or a calculated act of evil. The public was divided. Some saw her as a broken teenager failed by those around her, while others demanded justice for the innocent lives she had taken. As the investigation unfolded, the prosecution worked to build a case against Ellie. They had the physical evidence: the knife, the fingerprints, the journal entries, and the psychological assessments that suggested premeditation. But Ellie's age complicated matters. At 14, she was a minor, and the question of whether she should be tried as an adult loomed large. The defense argued that Ellie was mentally ill, incapable of fully understanding her actions, while the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who had carefully planned the murders. The trial, when it finally began, became a media circus. Psychiatrists testified about Ellie's mental state, offering conflicting opinions on whether she could be rehabilitated. Her teachers and classmates took the stand, their testimonies providing a glimpse into the years of isolation and bullying that had shaped her. The most damning evidence came from the crime scene itself, the forensic analysis, the footprints, and the chilling contents of her journal. Ellie sat through it all in silence, her expression blank, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The verdict, when it came, brought little closure. Ellie was declared guilty, but mentally ill, sentenced to an indefinite stay at a high-security psychiatric facility. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the judge handed down the ruling, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Ellie showed no reaction, her face as unreadable as ever. She was led away in handcuffs, her small frame dwarfed by the officers flanking her, the whispers of the crowd following her out of the courtroom. In the years that followed, the case of Ellie Carter continued to haunt those who had been involved. The campsite remained a grim landmark, overgrown with weeds and visited only by the occasional curious onlooker. The forest, once a place of beauty and solitude, became a symbol of tragedy and unanswered questions. For Ellie, life in the psychiatric facility was a blur of therapy sessions and evaluations, her days marked by the monotonous routine of institutional life. She rarely spoke, her silence leaving her therapist to wonder if she was truly beyond reach or simply unwilling to be saved. The investigation, though closed, left behind echoes of doubt and sorrow. No one could say for certain what had driven Ellie to commit such an unthinkable act. Was she a victim of her own mind or a predator hiding in plain sight? The truth remained as elusive as the girl herself, locked away in the quiet corners of her fractured psyche.